Langston Reed, a highly respected black heart surgeon, visits a small town seeking peace, but is instead targeted by Officer Daniels, a racist cop who abuses his power. What begins as subtle harassment escalates into a series of unjust confrontations, with Daniels determined to humiliate Langston simply for existing in spaces he deems off-limits. As Langston faces racial prejudice and systemic bias, his quiet dignity and refusal to back down expose the unsettling realities of racism in America. This story highlights the infuriating abuse of authority and the relentless struggles faced by those who demand justice and respect. The courtroom smelled of aged wood and fresh ink, familiar, steady, and unrelenting. Judge Nathaniel Calloway had long grown accustomed to this space. His black robe, heavy on his shoulders, yet a symbol of authority, rippled slightly as he moved to take his seat. It was a modest courtroom, tucked away in the heart of a small town where every face was recognizable. But today, it felt different. Today, the weight of expectation hung thick in the air. Nathaniel surveyed the gallery. A handful of attendees sat scattered across the benches, clutching their coats and bags. Some were whispering, others staring ahead, their faces carrying the kind of indifference one learns from a life spent waiting for decisions that rarely fell in their favor. Nathaniel understood those looks. He'd seen them all his life. He adjusted his glasses and nodded to the clerk, who stood to begin the proceedings. The rhythm of his routine, calm, measured, disciplined, never faltered. Nathaniel had risen through the legal world with that same steadiness, a man who listened more than he spoke and acted only when it counted. At 45, he was one of the youngest judges to hold his position in the county, his reputation forged not from connections, but from integrity. A black man sitting on the bench in Millbrook had not been welcomed with applause. It had been earned through patience, grit, and an unshakable sense of justice. Today's case was routine, on paper, at least. A dispute over a property line, neighbors bickering about inches of land. To Nathaniel, it was an opportunity to mediate, to remind the town that fairness was his guiding principle. Yet, something about the air prickled at him, an unease that refused to be named. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a groan. Nathaniel glanced up out of habit and immediately knew why the tension had settled in his bones. Officer Daniels entered, his boots thudding deliberately against the floor as he walked to the plaintiff's side of the room. The sound turned heads, drew whispers, and fractured the stillness Nathaniel had worked so hard to preserve. Daniels was a tall man, broad-shouldered with a chest that seemed perpetually puffed out, as if his very presence needed to dominate every space he entered. His uniform, pristine and overstarched, gave him an aura of authority he wore like armor. But Nathaniel knew the truth. Daniels wasn't a man of integrity. He was a man of entitlement, a man whose power had gone unchecked for far too long. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but the judge's gavel in his hand felt heavier than usual. He had tangled with Daniels before, not in words, but in purpose. Millbrook's police department had a way of looking the other way when Daniels' name came up in complaints. Excessive force, harassment, intimidation. Whispers Nathaniel had heard for years, but never seen addressed. And here he was now, a figure of power trying to tip the scales in his favor once again. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. His role wasn't to make this personal. It was to be impartial. And yet, as Daniels caught his eye with a smirk, one that barely curled his lips but carried layers of meaning, Nathaniel felt the simmer of something deeper. Resolve. "Court is now in session," the clerk called, her voice slicing through the tension. Nathaniel adjusted his glasses again, his tone measured and deliberate as he began. "We'll proceed with the facts, and nothing but the facts." It was his usual line, a quiet reminder to everyone present that justice had no favorites. But Daniels's smirk remained, as if he knew something Nathaniel didn't. Let him smirk. Nathaniel thought justice isn't decided by arrogance. This opening section introduces the protagonist, Judge Nathaniel Calloway, a black man of quiet power and dignity in a small-town courtroom. It sets up the antagonist, Officer Daniels, whose aura of unchecked authority begins to signal trouble. Tension builds subtly, hinting at an imminent conflict, while Nathaniel's resolve and moral strength ground the audience. The rain came down in thick sheets, pattering against the roof of Langston Reed's car, as he eased it into a parking spot outside Benny's diner. Through the windshield, the warm glow of the neon sign cut through the misty afternoon, flickering slightly with each pass of the rain. Langston sat for a moment, the low hum of jazz spilling softly from the car speakers, his hands resting on the leather steering wheel. Benny's diner wasn't anything special. Its faded yellow awning drooped under years of weather, and the door jingled when it opened like something out of an old film. But to Langston, it was one of those rare places where time stood still. A little pocket of simplicity, amidst a complicated world. And that was exactly what he needed right now. Langston Reed wasn't the kind of man you'd notice if you weren't looking closely. His presence was understated, not flashy. At 53, he wore his years well, a clean-shaven head with specks of gray along the edges, glasses perched low on a broad, dignified nose, and a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. He was tall but not imposing, built with the lean strength of a man who spent years enduring long shifts on his feet. To the world, Langston Reed was Dr. Langston Reed, a leading cardiothoracic surgeon, philanthropist, and respected member of his community. Headlines and hospital reports told the story of a man who'd saved lives, one meticulous procedure at a time, for over 2 decades. Yet, if you'd passed him on the street today in his simple gray coat, dark slacks and well-worn shoes, you'd think he was just another man running errands in a small town. That was intentional. Langston preferred it that way. Titles and wealth never impressed him. He'd grown up in a little one-story house on the south side of Millbrook, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who taught him that respect was earned, not demanded. Langston had carried those lessons with him through years of education, through the walls of hospitals and operating rooms. He might have been wealthy now, but he never forgot where he came from. He stepped out of the car and into the rain, pulling his collar up against the cold. It was the kind of weather that made the world feel small and intimate. He liked that. Inside Benny's diner, the smell of bacon grease and coffee enveloped him immediately. The place looked like it hadn't changed in 40 years. Red vinyl booths, linoleum floors, and a jukebox shoved into the corner that hadn't worked in at least a decade. A handful of patrons occupied the space, scattered among booths and bar stools. A trucker with a ball cap perched low over his face nursed a plate of fries. An older couple huddled together in the corner, sharing a slice of apple pie. Langston offered a nod to Benny, the diner's owner, who stood behind the counter wiping his hands on a dish towel. Benny was a wiry man in his 60s, with hair as white as the whipped cream on his pies. "Afternoon, Doc," Benny called, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the room. "The usual spot?" "Please," Langston replied with a faint smile. Langston made his way toward a booth by the window, the one with the best view of the parking lot and the road beyond. It was his favorite place to sit, tucked just far enough into the corner that he could observe without being observed too much. He shrugged off his coat and slid into the booth, the vinyl squeaking faintly under his weight. Outside, the rain streaked down the window, turning the world into smudges of gray and gold. It was peaceful. For about 5 minutes, Langston heard the door jingle again, followed by the sound of heavy boots clomping across the linoleum floor. He didn't look up at first, his focus on the menu in front of him, even though he already knew what he wanted: black coffee and a turkey club. But then he felt it. A shift in the air. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A quiet crack in the stillness, like a ripple across the surface of water. Langston had felt it many times before. It was the kind of awareness that came when someone decided he didn't belong somewhere. "Afternoon, Officer Daniels," Benny said, his voice taking on an edge of caution. Daniels, Langston thought, the name clicking in his mind like a stone dropping into place. He glanced up slowly, and sure enough, there he was, Officer Ryan Daniels. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, and smug, in a way that had nothing to do with his badge and everything to do with the man wearing it. His Millbrook PD uniform was crisp, the shiny metal of his belt reflecting the light. But his face, pale, with a jaw that always seemed to be set in mild irritation, was what people remembered most. Daniels' reputation preceded him. He was one of those officers who'd been around forever, who walked the fine line between authority and abuse of it. Rumors had circulated about Daniels for years: excessive stops, intimidation, especially toward the town's black and Latino residents. But nothing had ever stuck. Complaints were whispered about, then dismissed. People learned to avoid him. Langston didn't look away as Daniels's gaze landed on him. There was no surprise in the officer's expression, only something cold and vaguely assessing. Daniels didn't sit right away. Instead, he lingered near the counter, his body turned just enough so that Langston knew he was being watched. Langston returned his attention to the window, letting his shoulders relax as he exhaled slowly. Not today, he thought. Anything else for you, officer? Benny asked from behind the counter. Nope, Daniels replied, his voice carrying. Just grabbing a cup of coffee seems like the rain's got everyone holed up inside. He laughed at his own joke, though no one joined him. Langston could feel Daniels' presence as he approached, his boots striking the linoleum with an intentional rhythm. Afternoon, Daniels said, stopping by Langston's booth. Langston looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with polite calm. Afternoon, Officer Daniels. Daniels tilted his head, his expression hovering somewhere between curious and challenging. Don't think I've seen you in here before. I come in from time to time, Langston replied, keeping his voice even. Nice place, good food. Daniels smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. That so? Langston didn't rise to the bait. He was good at that. Calm, steady, unshaken. He'd learned over the years that a man like Daniels fed off reactions. It was a game he wouldn't play. Well, Daniels said after a moment. Enjoy your meal. Thank you, Langston said. Daniels lingered for another beat, before turning and walking back toward the counter. Langston watched him go, something sharp settling in his chest. It was the way Daniels looked at him, the subtle suspicion, the judgment behind his eyes, that stirred something deeper. Langston had spent years earning his place in rooms where he wasn't welcome, but this was different. He picked up the menu again, though he wasn't reading it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, streaking down the window in slow, deliberate lines. The shift in the air lingered, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Langston sipped his coffee slowly, letting its warmth settle in him as he tried to shake off the weight of Daniels's lingering presence. For a man who rarely spoke more than a sentence, Daniels had a way of making every word feel like a loaded weapon. Langston glanced around the diner. The other patrons seemed to have gone back to their meals, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The older couple in the corner kept stealing glances at him, their expressions unreadable. The trucker 2 booths down barely touched his fries now, his ball cap tugged lower, as if pretending not to watch. Langston had seen this look before. A shared discomfort that no one wanted to name. He turned back toward the window, watching the rain trail down the glass. Calm, he told himself. Breathe. Moments like this weren't new. Langston had lived a life of contrasts. He could hold someone's heart in his hands in an operating room, yet out here, in small corners of America like Millbrook, he was often just another black man to be questioned, scrutinized, doubted. It was a balance he'd perfected over the years. Quiet strength, steady composure. Never give them what they want. An excuse to tear you down. The door jingled again, louder this time, and Langston's gaze flicked upward as 2 more officers stepped into the diner. Daniels greeted them with a nod, leaning lazily against the counter with his coffee in hand. Afternoon, fellas, out in this weather, huh? Not much choice, is there? One of the officers, a stocky man with a buzzed head, replied with a grin. Slow day, though. Slow until it isn't, Daniels said casually. His eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, in Langston's direction. Langston didn't react, but he felt it. That deliberate little gesture. It was a quiet signal, meant to stoke curiosity, to start a narrative. And it worked. The buzzed officer followed Daniels' gaze, his brow creasing slightly as his eyes landed on Langston. Who's that? Langston didn't move, though his grip on his coffee cup tightened ever so slightly. Daniels shrugged, though the smirk on his face betrayed him. Don't know, doesn't seem local, just grabbing some coffee. The buzzed officer stared a beat longer before turning toward Langston, stepping up to the edge of his booth like a man checking for something out of place. Afternoon, the officer said, his voice neutral but edged with a subtle weight. You passing through? Langston set his coffee cup down gently and turned his gaze upward, meeting the man's eyes. Something like that. You from around here? No, Langston replied evenly. But I grew up in Millbrook Southside. The officer's expression shifted slightly, though it wasn't clear whether it was surprise or something else. Haven't seen you around. I haven't lived here in a long time. The officer nodded, though it was a stiff, perfunctory motion. Langston could see it now, the way the man's gaze lingered on his modest coat, his hands folded neatly on the table, as if searching for something to explain his discomfort. You got family in town? Langston let out a slow, measured breath. No. The officer's mouth tightened, and he glanced back at Daniels, who sipped his coffee like the conversation didn't concern him at all. Mind if I ask what you're doing here then? The officer pressed. Langston smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm having lunch. Benny's voice cut through the tension then, sharp and clipped. You boys need something, or are you just here to bother my customers? The officer glanced toward the counter, clearly irritated at the interruption. Daniels, still leaning against the counter, grinned faintly but said nothing. Just making conversation, the buzzed officer muttered. Well, take it somewhere else, Benny shot back, his voice gruff. Man's not doing anything but minding his business, same as you. Langston turned his head slightly, offering Benny a small nod of thanks. He didn't need anyone to fight his battles, but he appreciated the gesture. The officer hesitated for a moment longer, as if considering whether to press further. Then he took a step back, hands on his belt. Enjoy your lunch, he said stiffly, before heading back toward the counter. Langston watched him go, the quiet thrum of adrenaline still pulsing under his skin. He reached for his coffee again, but his hand paused mid-air when he caught Daniels watching him. Daniels smiled, a slow, smug expression that felt more like a threat than anything else, and tipped his coffee cup toward Langston in mock salute before turning away. Langston finished his lunch in silence, the tension in the diner slowly ebbing but never quite disappearing. By the time he stepped back into the rain, his shoulders felt heavier than they had when he'd arrived. He climbed into his car, resting his hands on the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, calm, composed, but tired. Driving through Millbrook's streets felt strange, almost like walking through the ruins of an old memory. The town had changed in some ways. The buildings were cleaner, shinier, but in other ways, it was exactly the same. Familiar landmarks blurred past his window. The park where he'd played as a boy, the corner store where his mother used to send him to buy bread and milk. He didn't expect to feel this way. Uneasy, unwanted. Langston pulled into a gas station on the edge of town, needing a few minutes to clear his head before heading back to the small bed and breakfast where he was staying. He'd been in Millbrook for just 2 days, attending a medical conference at the local hospital, but he was already counting down the hours until he could leave. As he climbed out of the car and began to fill his tank, a black and white police cruiser pulled into the lot. Langston's back stiffened instinctively as he recognized the vehicle. Daniels stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, as he walked toward the gas station's small convenience store. But then, halfway to the door, he stopped and turned back toward Langston. Afternoon again, Daniels said, his voice dripping with faux politeness. Langston glanced up, keeping his expression neutral. Afternoon. Daniels stuffed his hands into his pockets and nodded toward Langston's car. Nice ride rental? Langston met his gaze evenly. No, it's mine. Daniels tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Must have set you back a pretty penny. Langston didn't respond. He could feel where this was going, and it made his jaw tighten. Daniels took a step closer, his smile widening. You know, it's funny. A lot of cars like this end up flagged for, suspicious ownership. You mind if I run the plates? Langston's knuckles turned white on the gas pump handle. Calm, he reminded himself. Always calm. Is there a reason you think my car needs to be checked? Langston asked, his voice steady. Daniels shrugged. Routine procedure, can't be too careful. You know, a lot of folks coming in and out of town these days. Langston stared at him, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. I'm not the one you're worried about. I'm just the one you've chosen. Before Langston could respond, Daniels smirked again and added, unless, of course, there's something you'd like to tell me about where you got that car. Langston felt the heat rising in his chest, rage held carefully behind a locked door. He opened his mouth to respond, to remind Daniels exactly who he was and what he stood for, but he stopped himself. Not here. not like this. Instead, Langston inhaled deeply, fixing Daniels with a calm, unblinking stare. "You do whatever you think you need to do, officer." Daniels held his gaze for a moment longer, as if trying to find a crack in Langston's resolve. When he didn't, the officer let out a quiet chuckle. "You have a good day now." With that, Daniels turned and walked into the convenience store, leaving Langston standing there in the rain, his hands trembling slightly as he replaced the gas nozzle. Langston sat in his car for a long time after that, staring out the windshield as the rain blurred the world outside. His heart was steady again, but the knot in his chest wouldn't unravel. He thought about calling someone, an old friend, a colleague. But what would he say that Officer Daniels had rattled him, that a man with a badge and a smirk could still make him feel small, even after everything he'd accomplished? Instead, Langston turned the key in the ignition and pulled back onto the road, his grip on the steering wheel firm. He wasn't done with Millbrook yet. The next morning, Langston woke to gray skies and the low rumble of thunder in the distance. The storm outside mirrored the unease that simmered within him. He'd barely slept, the events at Benny's diner and the gas station replaying over and over in his mind like a song stuck on repeat. By mid-morning, Langston found himself back at Millbrook General Hospital, attending the final sessions of the medical conference that had brought him to town. The sterile halls and polished floors were familiar, a stark contrast to the tension of the past day. Here, he was Dr. Langston Reed, the respected surgeon, the guest speaker, the man whose skills were trusted in the operating room. And yet, he could still feel Daniels's smirk. That smug look had burrowed into his mind, as if daring him to forget it. He refused to. At the conference luncheon, Langston sat at a table near the back, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. Colleagues and doctors milled around the large banquet hall, their voices a low hum, punctuated by bursts of polite laughter. Mitchell Jenkins, an old friend and fellow surgeon, dropped into the seat across from Langston with a sigh. "You look like hell, Lang," he said, though his voice held more concern than humor. Langston offered a faint smile. "Long night." "Something tells me it's more than that." Mitchell leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I saw your face during yesterday's presentation, like your mind was somewhere else. What's going on?" Langston hesitated. Mitchell had been a friend for years, one of the few people who'd understood what it meant to walk the tightrope of success as a black professional in a world that didn't always know how to reconcile their achievements with its assumptions. "I had a run-in with a cop yesterday," Langston said finally, keeping his voice low. Mitchell's expression darkened. "What kind of run-in?" "The kind that sticks with you." Langston pushed his coffee aside, his fingers pressing lightly against the table. "His name's Officer Daniels." "You know him?" Mitchell's lips thinned into a hard line. "Everyone knows Daniels. He's been a stain on this town for years, runs things like it's still the 1950s, people complain, but nothing sticks. He's got friends in high places. Why'd he come after you?" Langston shook his head slowly. "I didn't give him a reason, he decided to make one." Mitchell sat back in his chair, his face a mix of frustration and resignation. "That's Daniels for you. He's the kind of guy who gets away with it because people are afraid to push back." Langston's jaw tightened. Maybe it's time someone did. Mitchell's gaze sharpened, his tone cautious. "Lang, I get it. I do. But Daniels isn't just one man, he's a symptom of something bigger, something this town doesn't want to deal with." "I'm not afraid of him, Mitch." "I know, but don't underestimate what he'll do to protect his power." Langston didn't respond right away, his mind already turning. Daniels had underestimated him. He thought Langston was just another black man passing through, someone who would take the harassment, swallow the indignity, and leave town quietly. He was wrong. That afternoon, Langston had just returned to his car after his final speaking session, when he saw the cruiser parked across the street. Daniels was leaning against it, arms crossed, his face split into that same smug smirk. Langston's first instinct was to ignore him. He didn't want to give Daniels the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under his skin. But as he opened the car door, Daniels pushed himself off the cruiser and sauntered toward him, his boots echoing against the pavement. "Leaving town so soon?" Daniels called, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Langston turned slowly, keeping his composure. "My work here is done." Daniels stopped a few feet away, his smile cold and calculating. "Shame you were just starting to fit in." Langston held his gaze. "Is there something you need, officer?" "Just doing my job." Daniel stuffed his hands into his pockets, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We've had a string of car thefts lately. Can't be too careful." "This your car?" Langston's fingers curled around his keys, though his face remained calm. "You already know the answer to that." Daniels took a step closer, invading Langston's space. "I don't like your tone." "And I don't like being harassed," Langston replied evenly. Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold menace. "Harassed? That's a strong word. I'm just asking questions, Doc. It's my job to keep this town safe." Langston took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "No, Officer Daniels. Your job is to serve and protect, not intimidate and harass." Daniel's face turned red, his jaw working as if he was biting back a retort. The tension between them was electric, the air so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Langston could see it in Daniel's eyes. The anger, the indignation at being challenged. It was the same look Langston had seen in countless others who couldn't stand to see a black man look them in the eye and hold his ground. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Daniel stepped back, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "Watch yourself, Reed. This town has a way of dealing with troublemakers." Langston didn't flinch. "I'm not the one causing trouble, Daniels. You are." Daniels stared at him for a long moment, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, before finally turning on his heel and walking back to his cruiser. He climbed in, slamming the door behind him, and the sound echoed like a gunshot across the empty lot. Langston stood there as the cruiser pulled away, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what Daniels was capable of, and now, Daniels knew that Langston wasn't backing down. That night, Langston sat in his small room at the bed and breakfast, staring at his phone. The screen glowed with Mitchell's number, but he hesitated before hitting call. What do I even say, he wondered. That Daniels was following him, watching him, that he could feel something bigger brewing, like the crackling air before a storm. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing, documenting everything that had happened. The diner, the gas station, the parking lot. Daniel's name appeared again and again, his actions laid out in precise detail. Langston wasn't sure what his next step would be, but he knew this. He wasn't leaving Millbrook without a fight. A knock at the door made him jump. He closed the laptop, his heart hammering as he stood and opened the door. It was the bed and breakfast owner, an older woman named Mrs. Callahan, who looked at him with thinly veiled concern. "Everything all right, Dr. Reed?" she asked, her voice soft. Langston forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am, just a long day." She nodded slowly. "Well, I thought you should know. There were a couple of police officers outside earlier, asking about you. I didn't tell them much, but... Is everything okay?" Langston's smile faltered. "I'll handle it. Thank you for letting me know." Mrs. Callahan hesitated, her hand lingering on the doorframe. "Be careful, Dr. Reed. This town, it doesn't take kindly to people stirring up trouble." Langston's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll be careful." As she left, Langston closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Langston lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling as the storm outside finally broke, thunder rumbling like distant drums. He knew what Daniels was doing, trying to push him, to break him, to make him feel unsafe. But Langston had spent his life proving people wrong. He'd done it as a boy on Millbrook's south side, as a med student in rooms where no one looked like him, as a surgeon whose hands could do what others couldn't. Daniels thought he'd chosen a man who would back down, but he'd chosen the wrong man. Langston's resolve hardened as lightning lit up the sky outside. Tomorrow, he would take the fight to Daniels. It was time to expose the truth. Let him come. Langston woke to a bright but brittle morning, the sun cutting through the rain-soaked clouds like shards of glass. The storm had passed, but the tension that lingered in the air felt thicker than ever. Millbrook had a way of holding its breath, as though waiting for someone to crack under its unspoken rules. Today, Langston wasn't playing along. He stepped into the quiet lobby of the bed and breakfast, nodding politely to Mrs. Callahan, who sat behind the desk, flipping through an old newspaper. Her eyes met his briefly, worry pooling in their depths. But she said nothing. Langston understood. People like Mrs. Callahan had spent years learning when to speak and when to stay silent. "Heading out, Dr. Reed?" she asked finally, her voice soft. "Just for a while," Langston replied, buttoning his coat. "I'll be back later this evening." Her gaze lingered. "Be careful." Langston offered a faint smile. "Always." The drive to Millbrook's town square was quiet, but the tension coiled tighter in his chest with every passing mile. He parked near the courthouse, a modest brick building with white columns and worn steps, and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Daniels wasn't going to stop. That much was clear. The past 2 days had been a series of moves and counter-moves, microaggressions escalating into outright intimidation. Langston had known men like Daniels his whole life. Those who hid their cruelty behind uniforms and badges, who wore authority like armor. Daniels believed he was untouchable. Langston intended to prove otherwise. His first stop was Millbrook's police department. He had considered going through formal channels back in the city, but this was where it needed to start. Daniels needed to see that Langston wasn't afraid, that he wouldn't be run out of town. Inside, the station was small and unassuming. Its walls lined with faded photographs of past police chiefs and dusty plaques honoring long-forgotten officers. A woman in her late 50s sat behind the front desk, her fingers clacking methodically on a keyboard. Her nameplate read, Marge Hensley. She looked up when Langston approached, her expression polite but guarded. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'd like to file a formal complaint," Langston said calmly. "It's regarding Officer Ryan Daniels." Marge's fingers stilled. The faint smile on her lips faltered, replaced by something less welcoming. "About what exactly?" Langston met her gaze evenly. "Harassment," repeated harassment. The woman sat back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are?" "Dr. Langston Reed." Recognition flickered across her face. Whether it was his title or his calm authority, Langston couldn't tell. She hesitated for a moment before reaching for a clipboard and sliding it toward him. "You'll need to fill this out. Details of the incident, date, time, all of it." Langston accepted the clipboard, but as he turned toward one of the plastic chairs in the waiting area, he heard the door to the back office swing open. Heavy footsteps followed. "Something wrong, Marge?" Langston didn't need to turn to know who it was. Daniel's voice carried that same smugness, like he'd already won a fight no one else was in. Marge glanced at him, then back at Daniels. "The gentleman is here to file a complaint." "Is that so?" Daniels said, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. He stepped into the room, and Langston turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. Daniels' uniform was crisp as ever, his belt heavy with the tools of his trade. "A complaint?" Daniels repeated, crossing his arms. "About what?" "You," Langston said simply. Daniels' smirk widened. "I'm just doing my job, Doc." "No," Langston replied evenly. "You're abusing your position, following me, harassing me, and making threats. That's not your job." Marge shifted uncomfortably behind the desk, her eyes darting between the two men. Daniels stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You want to play that game, huh? File your little complaint, see how far it gets you." Langston didn't flinch. "It's not a game, Officer Daniels." For a moment, the room fell silent, the air heavy with the unspoken challenge between them. Daniels' jaw tightened, his face flushing red. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered. "And neither do you," Langston replied. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the front door swinging open broke the tension. Both men turned as Mitchell stepped into the station, his expression sharp and focused. "Langston," he said, walking straight to him. "What's going on?" Langston exhaled slowly, grateful for his friend's presence. "Filing a complaint." Mitchell's gaze shifted to Daniels, his expression darkening. "Officer Daniels, isn't it?" Daniels's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Dr. Mitchell Jenkins," he replied. "I'd be careful if I were you. Dr. Reed is a respected surgeon, and any harassment won't end quietly. I'll make sure of it." Langston shot Mitchell a warning look, but his friend ignored it, his gaze locked on Daniels. Daniels stared back, his smirk faltering just slightly. "We'll see about that," he muttered finally, before turning and walking toward the back of the station. The sound of his boots echoed loudly until he was gone. Mitchell turned to Langston, his voice low. "You okay?" Langston nodded. "I will be." "Good," Mitchell said, glancing at Marge, who had returned to her desk, typing furiously. "Let's get out of here. I have a feeling Daniels isn't done yet." Langston spent the rest of the afternoon at Mitchell's house, both men seated in the small living room with cups of coffee that had long gone cold. Mitchell paced as Langston recounted the past few days, the diner, the gas station, the threats. "You need to get out of here, Lang," Mitchell said finally. "You've made your point. Don't let this escalate." Langston shook his head. "If I leave, Daniels wins. That's what he wants, to intimidate me into silence." "And if you don't leave?" Mitchell shot back. "Daniels isn't bluffing, he'll find a reason to come after you." Langston's jaw tightened. "Then let him come, I'm not running." Mitchell stopped pacing, his hands on his hips. "You're a stubborn man, you know that?" Langston offered a faint smile. "You didn't become a surgeon without a little stubbornness." Mitchell sighed, sinking back into his chair. "Fine. But I'm not letting you handle this alone. We'll take this to the higher-ups. Someone outside Millbrook Daniels has gotten away with too much for too long." Langston nodded, though the weight of the day still pressed against his shoulders. He knew Mitchell meant well, but he also knew what Daniels represented. This wasn't just about him, it was about power, unchecked and unchallenged, and the people who suffered because of it. He wouldn't let it stand. As the sun set, Langston returned to the bed and breakfast, his movements slow and deliberate. The small parking lot was empty, except for his car and a single police cruiser, its headlights off, but its presence unmistakable. Langston paused, his breath steady, then walked to the door. He didn't look back, but he could feel eyes watching him. Waiting. Inside, Mrs. Callahan was waiting at the desk, her face pale. "Dr. Reed," she whispered. "There were men here earlier. They asked about you again." Langston nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan." She hesitated, her voice shaking. "Are you sure you don't want to leave?" Langston looked at her, his expression calm but firm. "No, ma'am, I'm not leaving." Upstairs in his room, Langston dropped his bag onto the bed and sat down. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text. From Mitchell. "Be careful Daniels isn't done. Call me if anything happens." Langston exhaled, his resolve hardening. Outside, the faint rumble of a car engine reached his ears, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. He moved to the window, parting the curtain just slightly. A shadowy figure stepped out of the police cruiser, its outline unmistakable. Daniels. Langston's heart pounded, but he didn't move. Daniels stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for something, daring Langston to react. Then finally, he turned and climbed back into the car, pulling out of the lot with a slow, deliberate crawl. Langston stepped back from the window, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, Langston stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with a slow, deliberate calm. The tension in his shoulders had settled into something sharper, more focused. Resolve. He'd been pushed and tested, insulted and threatened, but this morning was different. This morning, Langston was taking back control. He closed the clasp on his watch and turned toward the bed, where his laptop sat open. On the screen was a document he'd been preparing for hours. Formal complaint and request for independent investigation, Officer Ryan Daniels. Attached were statements from witnesses at the diner, recordings of conversations Mitchell had managed to obtain from locals, and Langston's own written account of the harassment he'd faced. Langston stared at the screen, his chest rising and falling steadily. He'd send it as soon as he left this room. He'd make sure Daniels's name and actions didn't disappear into the shadows this time. As he closed the laptop, a loud knock rattled the door. Langston's muscles tensed. He glanced at the clock. 8:05 a.m. It was too early for housekeeping. He knew who it was. Knock knock. Langston moved to the door and opened it slowly. There stood Officer Daniels, dressed in his uniform but without the pretense of politeness. This time, his hands rested on his belt, thumbs hooked in the loops as he stared Langston down. Behind him, two other officers lingered near the cruiser parked in the driveway. "Mornin', Doc," Daniels said, his voice low and gravelly. Langston didn't flinch. "Morning, Officer Daniels. What can I do for you?" Daniels' lips curled into a smug half-smile, though his eyes were hard. "You can step outside for me. We need to have a little chat." Langston folded his arms, his voice calm. "If you've got something to say, officer, you can say it here." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Step outside, or I'll bring you out. Your choice." Langston looked past Daniels at the other officers. Their expressions were carefully blank, as though they were already disassociating from whatever was about to happen. A knot of anger tightened in Langston's chest, but he pushed it down, reminding himself to stay steady. "Fine," he said. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the cool morning air. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as Daniels led him a few feet from the doorway, just out of earshot of the building. The other officers didn't follow, but their eyes tracked his every move. Daniels turned to face Langston, his hand still resting on his belt. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "Coming into my town, stirring up trouble." Langston met his gaze evenly. "Stirring up trouble?" he repeated. "Is that what you call filing a complaint about being harassed?" Daniels let out a bitter laugh. "You don't belong here, Reed. Men like you think you can walk in and act like you're better than everyone else, like you own the world just because you've got a little money and a fancy title." Langston's fists curled at his sides, but he didn't move. "This isn't about me, Daniels. This is about you. Your arrogance, your abuse of power, your fear of anyone who doesn't fall in line." Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a hard, cold glare. "Watch your mouth." "No," Langston said sharply, stepping forward. "I won't watch my mouth. I've watched men like you my entire life, hiding behind your badges, using them like weapons to intimidate and destroy. You think that uniform makes you untouchable? It doesn't." Daniel's face flushed with anger, his nostrils flaring. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "I know enough," Langston shot back. "I know you picked me the second I walked into that diner because you decided I didn't belong. I know you followed me, harassed me, threatened me, all because I didn't cower in front of you, and I know you've done it before to people who didn't have the voice to fight back." Daniel stepped closer, his face inches from Langston's. "You better be careful what you say next, Reed." "Or what?" Langston demanded, his voice rising. "You'll arrest me for what's standing up to you. You want to play this game, Daniels? Fine, let's play, because I promise you, I will make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you are." Daniels stared at him, his breathing heavy. For a moment, Langston thought he might snap, thought he might reach for his cuffs or worse. But then Daniels smiled again, though it was a hollow, ugly thing. "You think anyone's gonna listen to you?" Daniels sneered. "You're just one man. I've been here for years. Reed, people trust me, people know me. You're nothing but a troublemaker passing through town." Langston took a steadying breath, forcing the fury down. "You keep telling yourself that." "Is that a threat?" Daniels snapped, his hand twitching near his belt. "No," Langston replied coolly. "That's a fact." Before Daniels could respond, another voice rang out behind them. "What's going on here?" Langston turned to see Mitchell striding across the driveway, his expression tight with anger. He held a folder in one hand, a clear look of purpose in his step. Daniels turned slightly, his posture stiffening. "This doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," Mitchell said. He stopped next to Langston, turning his glare on Daniels. "I've got copies of statements and evidence, people who've seen you harass Langston, who've seen you harass others. It's over, Daniels. We're taking this to the state." Daniels' face turned red, his mask of control slipping. "You can't." "Oh, we can," Mitchell interrupted, holding up the folder. This is just the beginning. Once we're done, every action you've taken will be scrutinized, every complaint buried under your friends in high places. And trust me, Daniels, the truth always comes out." Langston watched as Daniels faltered. The man who had walked with such arrogance now looked small, cornered. It was a brief glimpse of the truth that Daniels knew he was losing control. Daniels' gaze snapped back to Langston, his voice a low snarl. "You think you've won something here?" Langston stared at him, his voice calm and unshaken. "This isn't about winning, Daniels. It's about justice. It's about accountability. And I'm not stopping until you face both." For a moment, no one spoke. The air crackled with the weight of the standoff, then Daniels took a step back, his expression a mask of fury and humiliation. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stalked toward his cruiser, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and the car sped out of the driveway, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Langston let out a long breath, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Mitchell turned to him, his expression softening. "You okay?" Langston nodded. "Yeah." "You did it, Lang," Mitchell said quietly. "You stood your ground." Langston looked down at the gravel beneath his feet, then back toward the empty road where Daniels had disappeared. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, Langston felt like he'd taken the first step toward something real, something lasting. Mitchell clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Come on, let's get this to the right people." Langston nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "Let's finish this." As the two men turned back toward the bed and breakfast, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays across the pavement. The storm had passed, but the real work was just beginning. This section delivers the intense face-to-face confrontation between Langston and Daniels, exposing the officer's arrogance while showcasing Langston's unwavering strength. The stakes have peaked, and the stage is set for the resolution and aftermath. Langston parked his car in front of the town courthouse, the engine's hum dying to an unsettling silence. The low, somber clouds mirrored his mood, hanging over Millbrook like a warning. He adjusted his suit jacket, double-checked the thick folder of evidence on the passenger seat, and stepped out into the brittle morning air. Today, he was ready. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with hushed murmurs as Langston entered the main hall. He'd chosen this place on purpose, neutral ground, a place meant for justice. Mitchell had already arranged the meeting, the police chief, a representative from the state's internal affairs office, and a handful of others would be present. But Langston's focus was on one person, Daniels. He found him at the far end of the room, standing with two fellow officers like a lion guarding its territory. Daniels' face darkened the moment their eyes met, his posture stiffening. Langston walked toward the conference room without flinching, his shoes echoing sharply on the marble floors. Daniels followed. Inside, the tension was suffocating. The chief of police, an older man with gray hair and weary eyes, sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. A state investigator sat to his left, a tablet and notebook laid out in front of her. Mitchell was already there, nodding to Langston as he entered, his face tight with determination. Daniels slouched into a chair at the other end of the table, his gaze pinned on Langston with a mix of disdain and challenge. Langston placed his folder neatly on the table and sat down. "Let's get started," the chief said, clearing his throat. "Dr. Reed has requested this meeting to file a formal complaint and present evidence against Officer Ryan Daniels. I expect this to remain civil." Langston's voice was calm, but his words were precise and sharp. "Thank you, Chief. I appreciate the opportunity to address this matter. I'll make this simple. Over the past few days, I've been harassed, threatened, and repeatedly intimidated by Officer Daniels." Daniels' smirk grew, but Langston ignored it. He opened the folder, pulling out the first page. "This is a statement from Benny Thompson, the owner of the diner where Daniels confronted me without provocation. Benny confirms that I was minding my own business, but Daniels targeted me regardless." The state investigator glanced over the paper as Langston continued. "This," Langston said, holding up a photo, "is a picture of Daniels' cruiser following me after I left the diner. The timestamp matches my route to the gas station, where he approached me again, making thinly veiled threats." Daniels leaned forward, scoffing. "You calling that harassment? That's procedure." Langston turned his gaze on him, his expression unshaken. "No, Daniels, it's abuse of power, following someone, questioning them without cause, intimidating them. It's not procedure. It's a misuse of your badge." The chief glanced toward Daniels, his brow furrowing. "Is this true, Daniels? Did you confront Dr. Reed twice in one day?" Daniels' smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "He was acting suspicious. I did my job." "Suspicious?" Langston repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Sitting in a diner drinking coffee is suspicious now, pumping gas. What was it that made me suspicious, officer?" "The fact that I'm black." The room fell deathly silent. Daniels' face turned red, his jaw clenching, but Langston pressed on. "This isn't just about me," Langston said, turning to the state investigator. This is about a pattern I've spoken to other people in this town, people Daniels has followed, questioned, and humiliated, all under the guise of procedure. It's not a coincidence, it's a pattern of prejudice and abuse. Daniels slammed his palm on the table, the sharp sound reverberating around the room. "That's enough," he barked, his voice booming. "You don't know what you're talking about, Reed. You think you can walk into my town and act like you're better than everyone? Like you own the damn place?" Langston met his gaze, unflinching. "I never acted like I was better, but you decided the moment you saw me that I didn't belong. You looked at me and made assumptions about who I was and what I deserved. You didn't see a man, Daniels. You saw a target." The state investigator's voice cut through the tension. "Officer Daniels, please sit down." Daniels hesitated, his breathing hard and heavy, but he finally sank back into his chair. His face was a mask of barely contained rage. Langston placed another document on the table. "These are records of previous complaints filed against Officer Daniels, complaints that were dismissed or buried, but the statements are clear. Harassment unlawful stops intimidation. Daniels' behavior isn't an isolated incident." The chief's face paled slightly, his gaze shifting toward the investigator. "I wasn't aware of these." Langston leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "You weren't aware because nobody's ever held him accountable. He's been protected. By silence, by fear, by a system that allows men like him to abuse their power without consequences." Daniels shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're lying. Those complaints were nothing but troublemakers looking to point fingers." Langston stood as well, his voice rising to meet Daniels. "Troublemakers? Is that what you call every person who challenges your authority?" "I'm not lying, Daniels, and you know it. You've hidden behind your badge for years, but not this time. This time, people are listening." Daniels' fists clenched at his sides, his face red with fury. "You're gonna regret this, Reed." Langston stepped closer, his tone cold and unwavering. "No, Daniels. You will." The state investigator stood, her voice cutting through the charged air like a knife. "That's enough." She turned toward the chief, her tone sharp. "Given the evidence presented here, Officer Daniels is to be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Further action will be determined based on our findings." Daniels' face fell, the color draining from his skin. "You can't." "You're done, Daniels," Mitchell said, stepping forward for the first time. "It's over." The silence that followed felt deafening. Daniels stared at Langston, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief, but he didn't say another word. The chief looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 5 minutes. Langston finally exhaled, the adrenaline coursing through him like wildfire. He'd done it. He'd exposed Daniels for who he was, but as he looked around the room, he knew this wasn't over. "Thank you," Langston said quietly, addressing the investigator and the chief, "for listening." The investigator nodded. "This isn't the end, Dr. Reed. We'll follow this through." Langston turned, heading toward the door. Mitchell followed close behind, his voice low. "You did it, Lang. You held your ground." Langston didn't respond right away. Outside the courthouse, the air felt cooler, clearer, but the weight on his shoulders hadn't lifted entirely. Mitchell's words were true. He'd taken a stand, and Daniels would finally face scrutiny. But Langston knew how these things worked. Investigations could drag on, evidence could be contested, and Daniels wouldn't go quietly. As Langston reached his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking when he saw an anonymous text. "You don't know what you've started. This isn't over." Langston stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He glanced back at the courthouse, where Daniels had stood just minutes earlier. The fight wasn't over. But Langston Reed wasn't backing down. Langston sat in the small corner cafe, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the low murmur of conversation. The morning sunlight streamed through the wide windows, illuminating the folded newspaper on the table in front of him. The headline was bold, black, and unmissable. "Millbrook officer under investigation for misconduct and abuse of power." Below it, a grainy photo of Officer Ryan Daniels stared back at him. A man who, only days ago, had walked with unchecked arrogance, now reduced to a figure of public scrutiny. The accompanying article detailed Daniels' long history of harassment, including witness testimonies, past complaints that had been buried, and Langston's formal evidence. It was happening. Finally. Across from him, Mitchell sipped his coffee, his face a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. It's all over the news, Lang. Not just in Millbrook. Either regional papers are picking it up, Daniels won't get out of this one. Langston leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. It's a start. Mitchell nodded. The police chief put him on unpaid suspension yesterday. State Internal Affairs is digging through every file he's touched. By the time they're done, I doubt he'll ever wear that badge again. The words should have felt like victory, and they did, in part. But Langston couldn't shake the weight on his chest. It's not just Daniels, Mitch. It's the system that allowed him to get away with it for so long. How many people did he harass, intimidate, or worse, and no one listened? Mitchell sighed, leaning forward. You're right. But you've done something that no one else has, Lang. You stood up to him. You didn't let him bury you. And now the system has no choice but to look at itself. Langston met his friend's eyes, seeing the truth there. Mitchell was right. Daniels might have been the spark, but the fire had spread. People were talking. People were angry. And for the first time in a long while, they were demanding change. The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and press attention. Langston had expected pushback, people calling him a troublemaker or accusing him of playing the race card. And there were plenty who did, their comments bubbling up in anonymous articles or whispered conversations in town. But something else happened, too. People began to speak up. It started with small murmurs. A shop owner sharing how Daniels had once stopped her teenage son without cause. A truck driver recounting a night when he'd been pulled over and humiliated. The voices grew louder, stories emerging like buried roots finally breaking through the earth. Langston found himself at the center of it all. Not as a victim, but as a catalyst. One evening, as he prepared to leave Millbrook for good, he received a call from Benny Thompson, the diner owner. Benny's voice was quieter than usual, tinged with emotion. I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Reed, Benny said. You didn't have to fight like you did. You could have left this place and never looked back, but you didn't. You showed all of us that it's okay to stand up, even when it's hard. Langston swallowed the lump in his throat. Thank you, Benny. That means more than you know. 2 weeks later, Daniels's career was officially over. The investigation uncovered a damning pattern of misconduct stretching back years. His suspension turned into a termination, his name stripped from the honor boards that once celebrated him. The police chief resigned shortly after, citing health reasons, though everyone knew it was an admission of complicity. It wasn't justice in the truest sense. Langston knew that nothing could erase what Daniels had done to him, and so many others, but it was accountability, and that was a start. On Langston's last day in Millbrook, Mitchell picked him up from the bed and breakfast. The morning was crisp, the kind of fall day that felt like a promise of change. Langston carried a single suitcase and his laptop bag, the weight on his shoulders finally lighter than before. Mrs. Callahan was waiting by the front desk. She smiled faintly, though her eyes were misty. You'll be missed around here, Dr. Reed. Langston smiled softly. Thank you, Mrs. Callahan, for everything. You're always welcome here, she said. You stood up for this town, even when it didn't deserve it. Langston gave her a grateful nod, then stepped outside to where Mitchell was waiting by the car. As they pulled out of the driveway, Mitchell glanced over. You sure you're ready to leave? Langston looked out the window at the quiet streets of Millbrook, the town both familiar and foreign to him now. It's time, Mitch. My work here is done for now. Where to next? Mitchell asked. Langston thought for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Home, then back to the city. I've got patients waiting for me. And after that? Langston turned, his voice steady. I'll keep fighting. Maybe it's not Daniels next time. Maybe it's someone else, somewhere else. But I'm not done, Mitch. I've seen what happens when we stay silent, and I won't let that happen again. Mitchell smiled faintly, shaking his head. You're a better man than most of us, Lang. Langston didn't respond right away, his mind already on the work ahead. He knew this wasn't the end, not for him, not for the people of Millbrook, and not for the fight against the systems that allowed men like Daniels to thrive. But for the first time, Langston believed change was possible. As they drove out of town, Langston looked in the rearview mirror, watching the buildings shrink in the distance. Millbrook had tried to break him, but it had failed. Instead, it had made him stronger, more determined, more resolute. And as the road stretched out before him, Langston Reed knew that his fight was far from over. Langston stood at the edge of the balcony, the warm afternoon breeze carrying the faint hum of city life from below. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, a mixture of towering skyscrapers and winding roads, a sharp contrast to the quiet, insular streets of Millbrook. In his hands was a letter from Benny Thompson, postmarked a week earlier, the ink smudged in places, but the words clear. Dr. Reed, you reminded us that standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's worth it. People are talking, changing. Thank you for showing us how. Langston folded the letter carefully and placed it on the small table beside him. Messages like this had begun to trickle in over the last few weeks, not just from Millbrook, but from towns and cities he'd never been to. Some wrote to share their own stories of being mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. Others simply thanked him for being a voice they felt they couldn't find within themselves. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero. He was a surgeon, a healer by trade, not an activist or a crusader. But Millbrook had changed him. Daniels had tried to strip him of his dignity, to reduce him to silence. But in doing so, Daniels had ignited something far more powerful: Langston's resolve. Looking back, Langston realized that his ordeal in Millbrook was not an isolated experience. It was a reflection of a broader, deeper problem that stretched far beyond a small town and its crooked officer. Racism wasn't always loud and obvious. It could be subtle, cloaked in polite suspicion, in a glance that lingered too long, or a question that shouldn't have been asked. It hid behind procedure, behind the words "you don't belong," spoken without being spoken at all. Langston had spent years proving himself, not just as a surgeon, but as a man worthy of respect. His education, his skill, his success, they had earned him a seat at any table. Yet Millbrook reminded him that for people like him, success could still be questioned, dignity could still be challenged, and belonging could still be denied. And he wasn't the only one. It wasn't lost on Langston that Daniels had wielded his power with impunity for years, because others, good, well-meaning people, had stayed silent. They looked away, they rationalized, they chose comfort over confrontation. That silence was what allowed Daniels to thrive, his abuses buried under layers of complacency and fear. It was this realization that stuck with Langston the most. Racism, abuse, and injustice didn't persist because of men like Daniels alone. They persisted because people allowed them to. Langston's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the balcony door. He turned to find his assistant, Claire, standing with her tablet tucked under her arm. "Dr. Reed," she said with a smile, "the board meeting is starting in 5. "Thank you, Claire, I'll be there shortly." She nodded and disappeared back inside, leaving Langston to collect his thoughts. The board meeting was important, but not for the usual reasons. Today, Langston was proposing the launch of a new program at the hospital. The Millbrook Initiative, a community outreach program aimed at addressing healthcare inequities in underserved and overlooked areas. It would focus on free clinics, mentorship for young medical professionals of color, and partnerships with organizations fighting systemic bias in medicine. Langston knew that structural change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that every step, every effort, mattered. His time in Millbrook had shown him that while the fight against injustice could feel endless, the simple act of refusing to back down was often the most powerful thing one could do. Later that evening, Langston sat in his office, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating a small stack of letters and notes. Among them was a message from Mitchell, short and direct as always. "Town's quieter now, Lang Daniels is out, and the new guy's got his head on straight. It's not perfect, but it's better. You made it better." Langston leaned back in his chair, a faint smile softening his face. You made it better. That was all he had ever hoped for. Not perfection, but progress. His phone buzzed, and Langston glanced at the screen. An email from a young medical student in Chicago. The subject line read, "Inspired by you." He opened it, his eyes scanning the words. "Dr. Reed, I saw your story about what happened in Millbrook. I wanted you to know, It gave me the courage to speak up about the biases I've faced during my clinical rotations. It's not easy being a black medical student in this system, but seeing you stand up reminds me I'm not alone. Thank you. Langston felt his throat tighten, the weight of the message settling deep in his chest. Not alone. It was true. Langston hadn't fought this fight alone. Mitchell had stood beside him. Benny had spoken up. People in Millbrook had found their voices, one by one. And now, strangers were drawing strength from his story, from his refusal to be silenced. It was proof that change didn't start with massive gestures or sweeping policies. It started with one person choosing to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better. It started with a single voice that refused to be ignored. The next morning, Langston stood at the podium in the hospital's conference room, presenting his proposal for the Millbrook Initiative to a room full of board members, colleagues, and community leaders. He spoke with calm authority, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. Access to healthcare is a human right, not a privilege, he said. But we know that isn't the reality for everyone, especially not for marginalized communities who face systemic barriers every day. I've seen it firsthand, and I refuse to accept it as inevitable. The Millbrook Initiative will help us bridge those gaps, one community at a time. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. As Langston stepped down from the podium, he knew the work was just beginning. But this time, he welcomed it. Weeks turned into months, and the ripples of Langston's fight continued to spread. The reforms in Millbrook's police department led to mandatory bias training for all officers, and Daniel's dismissal sent a clear message: abuse of power would not go unchecked. People in town still whispered about what had happened, but now those whispers carried a different tone, one of awareness, of reflection, and, in some cases, of quiet gratitude. Langston didn't return to Millbrook, but he didn't need to. The lessons he'd learned there had stayed with him, shaping the way he approached his work, his relationships, and his place in the world. He knew that racism, injustice, and abuse wouldn't vanish overnight. There would always be another Daniels, another town clinging to silence, another battle to fight. But Langston also knew that change was possible, because he'd seen it. He'd been it, and that was enough to keep him going. On a cool autumn evening, Langston sat in his living room with a cup of tea, his laptop balanced on his knees. He opened a blank document and began typing. Stories like mine aren't unique. They're shared across communities, generations, and people who have faced the same doubts, suspicions, and silencing. But there's power in speaking up, there's strength in standing firm, and there's hope in knowing that we're not alone in the fight for justice. He paused, the cursor blinking steadily on the screen, and then continued. The road is long, the work is hard, but the fight is worth it. As he typed, Langston couldn't help but think of Millbrook, the town that had tested him, changed him, and strengthened him. He smiled faintly, knowing that somewhere, someone else was beginning their own fight. And this time, they wouldn't be alone,